All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar co-hosted by Trellis Strategies. Throughout the course of our time together today, we'll learn a little bit about IHEP's work in the post-secondary value space, including a really quick overview of our interactive data tool, the Equitable Value Explorer. In addition, we have several of our wonderful research partners here today, all of whom have recently authored reports leveraging data from our tool as part of the research series, Elevating Equitable Value. These paper authors are here to share new insights into what they are learning and what the data can tell us about how students are experiencing post-secondary value today. All right. My name is Kim Dancy. I am the Associate Director of Research and Policy here at IHEP. Before we dive in, I do want to give a special thank you to Lauren McLeese, one of our research analysts here at IHEP. Lauren has been really instrumental in supporting the development of this research series and this webinar, and she's not able to join us here today, but I did want to flag that we really appreciate all of the work she's done to make this event possible. For those of you who are less familiar with IHEP, the Institute for Higher Education Policy, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and advocacy organization that is focused on building a more equitable and just society through the power of higher education. We do that by driving systemic change in order to advance equitable outcomes and generational impact for historically marginalized communities. One of our main focuses here at IHEP is really working to better understand and advance equitable post-secondary value. The explicit goal of this work is really to drive policy and practice change to advance post-secondary value, particularly for Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and underrepresented Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander students, as well as for students from low-income backgrounds and women. When we talk about post-secondary value, we leverage the following definition. Students experience post-secondary value when provided equitable access and support to complete quality, affordable credentials that offer economic mobility and prepare them to advance racial and economic justice in our society. In approaching this work, it is really important to have a way to measure and assess where things are going well, as well as where the post-secondary system needs to improve. We use the following economic value thresholds in order to measure the economic value that post-secondary education provides. And these really serve as key indicators of different levels of earnings and wealth that students are experiencing post-college. These thresholds are also really key components of some of the research reports that you'll hear about in just a moment. Our baseline threshold is called threshold 0, and this really represents the minimum economic return that students should receive from their time in higher education. A student meets this threshold if they are able to earn at least as much as a high school graduate, plus enough to recoup their total net price over the course of 10 years. Our next threshold is threshold 1, which represents the earnings premium, and a student meets this threshold if they earn at least as much as the typical earnings in their field of study. T2, or threshold 2, is our earnings parity threshold, which measures whether students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, and women are earning at least as much as the typical earnings of their more advantaged peers. Threshold 3 is informed by the work of the Opportunity Insights team in examining economic mobility. And this threshold looks at whether students earn enough to enter at least the 4th income quintile or 60th percentile earnings, regardless of their level of educational attainment. And finally, we do have thresholds 4 and 5, both of which are based on wealth as an outcome of post-secondary education, although we currently don't have sufficient data to measure wealth-based thresholds, so they will not be a feature in the research that you'll hear about momentarily. To really put this framework into action, IHEP has also led the development and maintenance of the Equitable Value Explorer, which is our interactive data tool designed to put the power of the post-secondary framework into the hands of decision makers and researchers alike. This tool is powered by publicly available data for more than 4,000 higher education institutions across the country and really shows how and how much these institutions are able to deliver equitable value right now. So for example, this screenshot from the tool shows the 25th percentile median and 75th percentile earnings from the college scorecard relative to each of the institution-specific value thresholds. And this really allows users to easily and interactively compare earnings outcomes of students with each of the value thresholds. In addition, we also wanted to deepen our understanding of equitable value across institutions and to engage new voices in the conversation, which is why we developed and spearheaded a research series centered around developing insights from the data that powers the Equitable Value Explorer. This series is entitled Elevating Equitable Value, Investigating Economic Outcomes of Post-Secondary Education, and consists of 7 research papers leveraging data from the Equitable Value Explorer. Each paper in this series offers fresh insights about the economic benefits of attending college and explores critical research questions about the equitable delivery of post-secondary value. In just a moment, we will hear directly from 3 of the authors in this series about their papers. But if you are interested in reading all 7 papers in the series or just learning more about this work, I would encourage you to navigate to ihep.org/EVE research. I believe someone will drop the link in the chat if that is easier for you as well. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our fantastic researchers who are here to share some of what they've learned from this research through a series of lightning talks. We'll have some time for audience Q&A towards the end of the webinar. So if you do have a burning question that comes up during any of these presentations, I'd highly encourage you to submit them using the Q&A function of the Zoom. So first up, we have Dr. Navi Dhaliwal of Dallas College. And without further ado, I will turn things over to Navi.
All right, thank you so much, Kim, and hello, everyone. My name is Navi Dhaliwal, and I'm representing the Research Institute at Dallas College, including my co-authors, Dr. Emily Sharma and Dr. David Mahan, who are in the audience. I'd like to thank the IHEP team, my co-panelists, and all of you for joining us today. Dallas College is a large urban community college in Dallas, Texas that serves over 100,000 students per year. And as we convene today during National Hispanic Heritage Month, I'm also proud to say that we're a Hispanic-Serving Institution, or HSI, with a mission of impacting income disparity in the communities we serve. And so it's through this lens that we approached our Elevating Equitable Value series research. Our project is entitled Equitable Value at Hispanic-Serving Institutions, National Trends with the Spotlight on Texas. And with Dallas College being one of the largest associate granting HSIs, a core motivation for our work was to use the Equitable Value Explorer to assess the economic outcomes of Hispanic students who represent nearly half of our student population. So very broadly, we wanted to study Hispanic students' post-college earnings and see whether Hispanic students were receiving a minimum economic return from college, whether they were achieving an earnings premium and earnings parity with other populations, and ultimately realizing economic mobility. So on the next slide, you'll see that our report offers descriptive evidence answering these questions at multiple levels. We started with a national picture looking at HSIs and emerging HSIs, primarily by using data available through the Equitable Value Explorer. Then we zoomed in on Texas in our report to use another data set which contained individual student level records. And this approach gave us a dual perspective on one, how well HSIs nationwide serve all of our students, and two, how well Texas institutions were serving Hispanic students in terms of their earnings and economic outcomes. So today I'll just share a few highlights from this study. Let's start on the next slide with our key findings at the national level. So using data from the Equitable Value Explorer, we examined over 5,500 post-secondary institutions around the country, and we split them into different types. We started by grouping them by predominant degree type. So you can see those are the columns, certificate or associate or bachelor's. And then we separated the institutions within each degree type into 4 groups. HSIs, which have Hispanic enrollment of 25% or more, emerging HSIs, which have Hispanic enrollment between 15 and 25%, other public and private nonprofits, and lastly, for-profit or proprietary institutions. From there, we asked what percentage of the institutions met the value thresholds. So T0, that minimum return, T1, earnings premium, or T3, economic mobility. So I'm just going to highlight a couple key takeaways, but in the full report, we've repeated this process by gender, by dependency status, and family income level as well. The first takeaway, if you look across the top row there, is that when it came to that minimum economic return, HSIs, emerging HSIs, and other public and private nonprofits all performed similarly well, with only for-profits falling behind. So 85% or more of HSIs and emerging HSIs across all 3 degree levels provided at least a minimum return. But the second big takeaway from this graphic, if you look at that final row, is that for T3 economic mobility, that rarely happened for any institution type except at the bachelor's level. And at the bachelor's level, all institutions except the for-profits, again, saw their median students meet T3 or threshold 3 at similarly high rates, over 70%, with a slight edge to emerging HSIs and HSIs. So on our next slide, we'll turn to a few summary findings from Texas. Using longitudinal data from the Texas Education Research Center at the University of Texas at Dallas, which functions like a state longitudinal data system, we were able to track the outcomes of Hispanic students throughout the state from pre-K-12 to post-secondary enrollment to the workforce. For our study, we looked at 6 cohorts of students who graduated from high school between 2009 and 2014 and entered a single college during the same year of their high school graduation. Then we observed the students' wages up to a decade after college entry. And we looked at each time point whether the students had achieved T0, T1, and so on for each threshold. So the figure on the screen shows the results for Hispanic students in the 2010 cohort. And the key takeaway is that the majority of Hispanic students in Texas had realized the minimum return by the 8-year mark. So more than half had realized the minimum return by the 8-year mark, with ultimately around 71% getting that minimum return by year 10. Just over half hit threshold 1 and threshold 3 within 10 years, and around 44% met threshold 2 earnings parity, meaning they had comparable earnings to white non-Hispanic workers within the state. Within our full report, we also considered how outcomes varied among Hispanic students, for instance, by gender, race, and first-generation status, and we dive further into our data for our own college. So thank you so much. I hope you'll give it a read, and this is just a snapshot of what we've done.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Navi. Next up, we have Dr. Angela Boatman of Boston College to present on behalf of her team.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Angela Boatman. I'm an associate professor in the Lynch School of Education and Human Development at Boston College, and I'm going to share a quick overview of our work on the economic returns of rural serving colleges. That was done with my co-author, Shadman Islam, who is also at Boston College. So the map on the next slide here is a map of the United States that illustrates a recent count of the metro and non-metro counties across the US. The yellow are considered the non-metro counties, and these include some combination of rural towns with fewer than 5,000 people and places of up to 50,000 people that are not part of larger labor market areas. But the primary takeaway here is to just observe how much of the United States land is made up of rural areas. What this map does not show you is also just the sheer population that live in rural parts of the United States. So about 1/5 of the US population lives in completely rural or mostly rural counties. Additionally, nearly 1/3 of all US high school students attend rural high schools. And we also know from other research that rural high school students graduate at a slightly higher rate than the national average, but they tend to enroll in college at lower rates compared to urban and suburban peers. So what Shad and I wanted to better understand in our project was to look at these colleges that are serving rural communities and to better understand the economic returns of attending these institutions and earning a degree from these places. But rather than adopt a discrete sort of rural versus non-rural definition, as this map is showing, we instead adopt this frame of rural serving rather than just rural located. And to do so, we use a measure that was created by the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges. And they created something called an RSI score. And it's a continuous measure that measures what they consider a rural serving institution score. It's comprised of 5 factors that they identify related to where a college is located, but also who it serves. And they categorize 2,500 institutions across the US on this score, a range from 0 to 4. So institutions that have a score of 1.175 to 2.14 are considered rural serving. And then scores above 2.14 are considered high rural serving. And interestingly, you can see some tidbits about some of the rural serving institutions here on this slide. 43% of all the colleges in the data set are considered rural serving, and 20% are considered high rural serving. Some of you may be surprised to learn that just under half of the public four-year colleges in the US are rural serving colleges, and just over half of America's community colleges are also rural serving colleges. Additionally, 1/3 of all HBCUs and nearly 20% of Hispanic serving institutions are rural serving. So many more diverse institutions making up rural serving colleges than some may have assumed. So what we did on our next slide is that we combined this RSI score data with the Equitable Value Explorer to sort of learn more about not only the types of rural serving institutions out there, but how those institutions are producing earnings for their students 10 years down the road. So we examined 2 relationships. The first is between the RSI score and the earnings of the students who attend an institution 10 years after enrollment. And to do this, we use a negative binomial regression. And then we also examine the relationship between the RSI score and the EVE thresholds that Navi just mentioned, using a logistic regression. And just as a reminder, we use 3 of the thresholds that Kim talked about at the beginning. We examine the minimum economic returns, the earnings premium, and the economic mobility. In these regression analyses, we also include a number of institutional and county level covariates. I've listed those here. So my next slide just plots some of the raw data from the combination of these 2 data sets. And this is plotting the median earnings of students relative to the economic value thresholds. So we utilize this violin plot so that we can visually depict the spread of the earnings and the density of the distribution within each of the categories. So the non-RSI, the non-rural serving institutions are in red, the rural serving colleges are in green, and the high rural serving colleges are in blue. And the x-axis here reflects whether students who attend the institution earn more or less than the calculated threshold value for that institution 10 years after initial enrollment. So colleges that are past that vertical line, that 0 line, are those where the average student who attended earned more than the institution's threshold value. So for example, we could look at threshold 0. Institutions above the 0 line there are likely to produce students who will earn enough to recoup the costs of their degree. And institutions below 0 are likely to produce students who do not earn enough to recoup the costs of their degree. So we can see here that RSIs and high RSI institutions are largely expected to surpass the threshold needed to meet the minimum economic return. But if you look at thresholds 1 and 3, the ability to sort of exceed that threshold is a bit more mixed. For both of those thresholds, median earnings appear to be below the value of the threshold for the majority, or close to about half, for RSIs and high RSI institutions. And these 3 pictures are just simply plotting the raw data. My final slide is a brief overview of the regression analyses that we did, and where we examined the relationship between the RSI score and the likelihood of meeting each of the thresholds. And so we find through this regression process that the rural servingness of an institution is statistically significantly predicting earnings, although the effect is pretty small. So for every 1 point increase in the RSI score, the expected earnings decrease by about 1.9%. And there's a few figures at the bottom of this here that also show that as the RSI score increases, the probability of meeting threshold 0 on the left here, it slightly decreases, but it's a pretty small magnitude. It's only a few percentage points. The slope there is not very steep at all. But the figure on the right shows the probability of meeting threshold 1, which was the earnings premium. You can see that as the RSI score increases, the earnings premium also decreases, but this time with a greater slope. So therefore, while it appears likely that a rural serving institution will earn at least the cost of a degree, this picture on the left, the likelihood of returning an earnings premium at these institutions hovers around 43 to 53%, which is shown in the threshold 1. And we don't observe a statistically significant relationship for threshold 3. So you can see these results, and you can also see how we separate these results by 2-year colleges, by 4-year colleges, publics and privates in our report, if you want to take a look there. We conclude our report by talking about the important role that RSIs play in increasing college access for rural students. The difference in earnings we observe across the RSI and high RSIs compared to the non-RSI colleges is pretty small. It's substantively small, and it does come with a really high likelihood of returning the cost of the degree to students who attend these institutions. Thanks.
Great. And next up, we have Sandra Barone of Trellis Strategies.
Great. Thanks, Kim. My name's Sandra Barone, and I'm representing Trellis Strategies and my co-author, Tanya Gardner. I'm very grateful to be part of this webinar and have really enjoyed listening to my fellow presenters. A big thank you to IHEP for funding this research and continuing to raise awareness about equitable value in higher education. Trellis has a long history of researching issues related to student financial wellness and student success. We're very excited to combine this research with the work of the Equitable Value Commission to dig deeper into the relationship between student financial wellness and economic outcomes for those students. This study set out to determine how the overall financial wellness of an institution's student body is correlated with their likelihood of meeting or exceeding the T0 threshold for a minimum economic return on their investment. In the full report, we also look at the T3 threshold, but we will only be discussing the T0 threshold today. Go ahead and the next slide. Trellis has administered, oh dear, my slide. This should say Student Financial Wellness Survey. Trellis has administered the Student Financial Wellness Survey annually since 2018. This study uses the survey data, the current study uses the survey data from the fall 2018 through the fall 2022 administrations of the survey. This provides a total population of nearly 200,000 student responses from 228 institutions in 33 states. The survey asks questions that cover student financial need, perceptions of institutional support, other students' responsibilities such as working and caring for others, and how students pay for school. Institutions that participate in the survey are primarily open admissions institutions, including about 70 Hispanic-serving institutions. Next slide. A subset of the questions from the wellness survey was used to develop 3 factors of student financial well-being. The first factor is financial stability, and this is intended to measure things like, is the student able to obtain money to cover unexpected expenses? Do they regularly run out of money or borrow money from others? The second factor represents financial confidence. Does the student worry about how they'll pay their bills or how they'll pay for school? Do they know how they'll continue to pay for school in the future? And the final factor measures financial behaviors. Does the student pay their bills on time, follow a budget, and do they believe they have the ability to manage their finances well? These factors were developed at the individual student level using the wellness data. And after developing these factors, students were then rank ordered according to their factor score. Students in the bottom quartile for each factor across all schools were considered to have low financial well-being. Students were then aggregated at the institution level by calculating the percent of students at each institution with low financial stability, financial confidence, or financial behaviors. So institutions with higher proportions of students with low financial well-being would be considered to be lower financial well-being schools. Next slide. Once we summarized those factors at the institution level, we were able to combine them with the data from the Equitable Value Explorer, or EVE. And only institutions included in both the EVE dataset and the wellness subsample are included in the analysis. The primary dependent variable for our analysis is the amount by which the median earnings of students from each institution differs from the T0 threshold for the institution. As you can see, the wellness institutions perform slightly worse overall than the nationally representative EVE sample. In all sectors, the wellness schools had lower median earnings than the total EVE sample. And also in the four-year sectors, fewer wellness institutions met the T0 threshold than in the full sample. So overall, we're working with institutions that are over-representing the lower level students in society. All right, next slide. We then ran multiple regression models to look at the relationship between the percent of students with low financial well-being at a school and the dollar amount by which median earnings at the school differed from the T0 threshold. Regressions were run for each factor separately and included multiple control variables listed on this slide. Models were run with all schools pooled, as well as for each school type separately, and results were largely consistent across the models. Next slide. The strongest results were for financial stability across all sectors and for all models tested. Schools with higher proportions of students with low financial stability had lower expected median earnings. This means that the students who are struggling financially are at schools where their expected return on investment is lower. Results for financial confidence and financial behaviors were less consistent, although similar to those for financial stability. And another interesting finding that wasn't the focus of our paper, but the percentage of women at an institution was also inversely related to the expected median earnings of that institution. However, the race was not significant in the majority of the models. If you pull up our full report, we also include some policy recommendations based on these findings and have full results by school type and for each factor separately. Thanks, Kim.
All right, thanks so much, everyone, for sharing more about your work. I am excited to moderate this discussion and to get to ask one of the first questions. So I noticed that all three of your papers really did a great job of both leveraging the data that's available in the EVE, but also pulling in data from other sources that really complements and supplements that work. So I'm wondering if you can share more about how other researchers might be able to leverage and combine data from the EVE with data from other sources to generate more comprehensive analyses. And any of you feel free to jump in. It's questions for all three of you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in. I think one of the things that's really exciting about the Equitable Value Explorer from a research standpoint is that it's a single location in which data from the college scorecard, iPads, and other sources are integrated together. But moreover, that it provides a cohesive framework with the value thresholds with which to think about equitable value. And so from an institutional standpoint, being based at a community college, we use the Equitable Value Explorer to pull up our profile for Dallas College. And we're able to use it to assess that the median student at our institution was earning a minimum return, at least as much as a high school graduate, plus enough to pay the cost of college. But we also were not meeting the economic mobility threshold. And so our charge and idea with bringing in administrative data from our state was to be able to unpack what we had at an institutional level at the individual student level. When we were able to do that with data from Texas, we found that for Hispanic students at Dallas College, around 80% were earning that minimum return. So more than just the median or more than 50%, but 80%. And then 60% were achieving economic mobility. I think this was really critical for us to bring in a different data source, in part because federally reported data on earnings by race and ethnicity are still not available through sources like the College Scorecard. So supplementing what was in the Equitable Value Explorer with another source of data allowed us to get a more nuanced view of what was happening at our institution.
Yeah, I will say that for what we were interested in studying, the EVE was ideal because what we were interested in looking at were differences across institutions. So the data in the Equitable Value Explorer being organized by institutions allowed us to then merge this with this other data set to identify rural serving institutions that already existed. And then from there, we could also identify other county level or state level variables to bring in. The nice thing about the Equitable Value Explorer is it includes a lot of information already on some of those characteristics. But if there were things that were not included, because we have the institutions, it was easy to merge in other county level or state level information. So I could see this being easily merged with state data that's at the institutional level, other information that might be in iPads that was not somehow captured in the EVE data set. One of the things we are exploring right now is the definition of a labor market. In the EVE, it's defined as like the average within a state. Could there be alternative definitions of labor markets? And it's possible to then merge this data set that already exists with others to explore alternative definitions of the local labor market. So I think there's lots of opportunities, but I'll turn it to Sandra, who also faced more. We didn't try to merge this with student level data for our particular question, but I'll turn it to you in the event that that's relevant.
Yes, I was going to say we had the opposite situation. So the big challenge for us was combining this institutional level data with our individual level survey data. We weren't able to directly relate an individual's student's level of financial well-being with their actual earnings after leaving the institution. But without the Equitable Value Explorer, we were left with those disparate measures of some sort of measure of earnings. So it allowed us, by transforming our survey data, to create that measure of financial well-being at the institution level, we were then able to combine those data sources and determine that relationship between the level of financial well-being at a school and the median earnings of their students. And further, because of the Equitable Value Explorer, we could compare those median earnings to the thresholds for T0 and T3. And I really encourage, not only was this a challenge, but it was also kind of one of the most exciting parts of the research. We probably didn't get it perfect our first try, but I really encourage other researchers to continue to think of novel ways to summarize the data at the institutional level. And so you can combine it with this rich EVE data source. And we're also continuing to think of new ways that we can kind of use this data to glean important insights from our other, specifically from student level data.
Thank you all so much for sharing those thoughtful answers. Switching gears a little bit, I'm curious if any of you have thoughts on how researchers can use the data that powers the Explorer to really dig into specific equity gaps in things like access completion or economic returns.
I'm happy to start here. I think the way that at least we approached our work was largely in two parts. One was just simply descriptive and like, what could we learn about these rural serving colleges? There was a really excellent chat and question in the chat from Martin about sort of just general gaps around who attends in certain terms of GPA or class ranks or who's attending these institutions. And I feel like there's an opportunity to explore descriptively some of these inequitable gaps that we just might not have had previously data that's able to support some of what exists there. And then secondly, to do, a more rigorous sort of predictive modeling that might also further help explain some of the gaps that we might have been observing in the first phase of that. But even said, like what we were able to do on this with this first pass in this first report was just sort of in these discrete, like looking at these rural serving institutions. There's much more that could be done here from our perspective around equity and equitable access to these institutions, looking at considering other aspects of the institution and like intersectional pieces here. So I heard Navi talking about gender and other characteristics of people who attend these institutions. Lots more could be explored there, both descriptively and in this sort of more predictive modeling method. So I guess I would just say I think this data set offers a lot of opportunity to dig into some of the gaps that we observe. And I think that's for us an important next step to consider not just rural serving institutions, but the intersection of Hispanic serving institutions in rural areas and the students that attend those schools, and to be able to more fully describe some of the characteristics of people attending these institutions to just paint a fuller picture. This still feels like a first effort to illuminate some of the gaps, but I think there's more to be done.
I'll jump in and piggyback on that, because I agree that one of the things that Equitable Value Explorer does is encourages conversations about particular populations of students that we feel may not be treated equitably. Our most recent student financial wellness survey in fall 2023 found that 21% of our respondents were parents and 68% of respondents worked while they're in school. And so these are just a couple of examples of how populations of students who used to be considered non-traditional are quickly becoming the traditional student, especially at certain institutions more than others. And they sometimes get lost in the conversation. And so I'm really excited about thinking about additional ways the EVE data could be used to compare institutions across metrics such as percent of students who are parents, percent who work, percent of part-time or commuter students at an institution. And like Angela was saying, intersections of these different populations become even more interesting. So one thing the research really raised to me is that even if we don't have perfect measures of value for these groups of students, we need to continue to include them in the conversation. And that's going to be critical to closing the gaps for all students.
I completely agree with my co-panelists, and I think that with our work primarily being descriptive, but having two different scopes, one sort of focused on the characteristics of HSIs nationwide, and another really focused on Latinx or Hispanic students at the individual level, but across the state of Texas, we were able to do more to explore some of those questions around intersectionality. And I think questions that the Equitable Value Explorer and Postsecondary Value Framework do a great job of raising, and also raising the question of, how can we get federal data or other data sources to capture those populations? So as a community college, we serve a diverse set of learners, including adult learners, parenting students. And although we weren't able to examine all of the populations we serve in our study, we were able to look at the intersection of Hispanic or Latinx identity with other identities. So gender with race, which was recorded separately in our research, as well as things like emergent bilingual status when in K-12 or immigration status in K-12. And I think we really wanted to challenge the notion that Hispanic students necessarily faced monolithic economic outcomes, or at least question that notion. Around half of students at Dallas College are Hispanic, so it was very important for us to disaggregate outcomes with this group and really follow up with qualitative research. Some of what we found, and I agree just initially, were things like an 8,000-year gap in earnings per year between Hispanic men and women, an $8,000 gap in earnings per year between students who identified as Asian and Hispanic, as I do, and students who identified as Black and Hispanic. And so I think it's one of the questions in the chat about what HSIs and institutions can do utilizing these data to remedy equity gaps. I feel like this starts a conversation for us about our career services at our institution, other academic supports to support completion and post-completion. And so I'd be happy to talk more about that in further questions, but I feel like this gave us the baseline of knowledge that we needed to begin that work.
Thank you all. And Navi, that's a great segue into my last question before we turn it over to the audience. I'm curious to hear if you all have thoughts on how researchers can translate their findings into actionable recommendations for policymakers and institutions from working with this data.
Yeah. I think one of the things the Equitable Value Explorer adds to the conversation is it allows researchers to provide leaders, whether at the institutional, state, national level, with concrete data regarding gaps in access, completion, and earnings across students and institutions. Our research highlighted the number of students with low financial stability and the fact that these students may not all have access to the same institutions as those who are more financially stable. Once we have this knowledge, we can pair it with a proposed solution and bring it to leadership. Our research for this series has highlighted the importance of continued support for need-based aid, not just Pell Grants, but small emergency grants and support for the entire cost of education, not just tuition. This probably ties in with some of the rural serving institutions that Angela found. Students may not have an opportunity to go elsewhere because of the additional costs. And so we want to continue to raise those issues with leadership. We haven't done it for this paper yet, but for other work, we have condensed our findings into a one-page infographic. That's an idea for how to share with institutions, and those can be focused at an institution level, or at a state level, or even a national level, and make an easy bite-sized pieces of information for policymakers. And yeah, with that, I'll pass it on to my other panelists.
I can jump in and kind of follow up on that last point about making recommendations actionable at the institutional level. I think with our research primarily being descriptive, we wanted to be really cautious about claims of causality, and it's one of the reasons why, to one of the questions in the chat, I think speaking with students about the pathways they pursue is an important follow-up to this work. But one of the things that we were able to do in our report was to separate out results by completion status as well as by major. And so across fields, we saw huge differences, up to $35,000 per year in median earnings 10 years after college among Hispanic students who entered into the lowest paying major, which was humanities and liberal arts, and those who entered into the highest paying major group, which in our study was architecture and engineering. And we also found that 29% of Hispanic completers were majoring in that lowest paying field, whereas only 6% were in the highest paying field. So while we can't make a causal claim from our research, I think it's insights like these that at the institutional level give us kind of diagnostic information that we still have work to do in terms of representation and recruiting into specific programs. That's one of the steps I think we're able to take coming out of this study.
Excellent. So we're going to pivot a little bit to some questions that you all have added to the Q&A function. The first is a little bit of a more technical question, but I'm curious to hear, and it is, how do you all handle the unevenness of missing data across institutions with regard to the college scorecard? In particular, how do we understand who is missing and what that means for the results?
I'm happy to jump in. That is a great question, and one that I deal with not only for this project, but for other work we do. There are definitely smaller institutions tend to be less represented in the college scorecard. So we are aware of that. And I have to say that is a place that we are currently developing ways to account for that. We were lucky in our study that since we were already looking at a subset, we only lost about 2 or 3 institutions due to the missing EVE data. But I think that's a great point and something to be aware of whenever you're using this data.
Yeah, we also used a subset of institutions that were defined in the RSI data set. So I think the missingness was somewhat minimized, but to Sandra's point, we tried to note once we started breaking out institutional types into 2-year publics and we looked at 2-year privates, they're so few, it's missing. And so we try to note places where we didn't trust, or wouldn't put a lot of stake in what we were observing there because the number of schools was so low. But in our instance, we used a subset to begin with, so we didn't end up losing a lot due to the college scorecard. But I do think that it's important to have a full understanding of just who is missing from the data sources that feed in to the Equitable Value Explorer.
All right, thank you. Thank you both for weighing in there. The last question that we'll have time for comes from the audience as well. And this one is, what further research do you think is warranted based on the results of these studies? And specifically wants to know if there are any additional projects that you all have in the works.
I can jump in briefly, I think we're really excited to extend this work to other populations at our college. And we started with a report around our role as an HSI, with nearly half of our population being Hispanic students. But I think that we want to replicate this to develop a deeper understanding within our state, within our institution, of the myriad populations that we serve. And particularly, I think one of the things we'd like to follow up on is with bachelor's pathways aligning so strongly with economic mobility across institution types. I think that's something we'd like to explore further in Texas, with us being a community college, is the transfer student population, how we can increase access to those bachelor pathways.
We are interested in one of the comments in the question box from Leah was consideration given to economic opportunity in the communities served by these colleges. And we're very interested in that question, and how can we more fully consider the economic opportunities, the role of the labor market in a local area at a more granular level, because a state, as we know, states, if you use the average of something across a state, there's lots of variability that exists even within a state, and sometimes even in a region. And so we are interested in trying to incorporate additional data sets to consider more fully, as I said earlier, alternative definitions of local labor markets, local economic opportunity, because I'm certain that is partly explaining some of what the options are for graduates, particularly when you're talking about rural serving areas.
We are interested in looking into, like I said, looking further into additional non-traditional student populations. That's an area we're working on in several ways. And so I definitely want to continue to look into that. And I'm also personally interested in looking at more than just the median earnings of these institutions, and using those 25th and 75th percentiles, comparing those to the thresholds to gain deeper insight into the differences. And then, as I was talking about, I feel like we can even improve what we did the first time in terms of taking individual student level and summarizing it at the institution level in order to do these comparisons. So those are the things that we're thinking about. No specific projects in the works, but there probably will be soon. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you all again so much for all of the work that you've done and for joining us today to share more about those findings. Do you want to take a minute to highlight the 4 other papers in this series? So in addition to what we've gone into detail on today's webinar, we have several other fantastic papers that I'd really encourage you all to check out. That includes a paper on adjunct labor and inequality in higher education by Frederick Tucker of SUNY, a paper entitled Place Matters, Exploring Geographic Variation in Equitable Post-Secondary Value Among U.S. Community Colleges by Roman Ruiz and Adam Hearn of the American Institutes for Research. A paper called Transforming at Scale, How ASCU's Student Success Equity Intensive Promotes Equitable Post-Secondary Value by Pratik Basavaraj and Morgan Taylor of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. And finally, Assessing the Value of Post-Secondary Education in Michigan, an equity-focused analysis by Monica Brockmeyer and Daryl Gardner of Wayne State University. In addition, I wanted to take just a second to flag what's next for IHEP in the post-secondary value realm. So first, we are in the process of adding new data to the Equitable Value Explorer tool, and this will allow users to investigate in even more detail how specific states and higher education institutions are performing against each of the value thresholds. And in addition to that, we are going to be continuing to engage with states and post-secondary institutions through the Value Data Collaborative, which is a project where we are really partnering with state agencies and institutions to develop data-driven projects geared towards better understanding and ultimately improving the value that students experience throughout their post-secondary journey. So with that, a big thank you to all of our panelists, all of the authors in our research series, the IHEP team, as well as everyone at Trellis Strategies for your support in making this webinar possible. We appreciate everyone in the audience for your time and energy this afternoon as well, and we hope you enjoyed the presentations and look forward to engaging with you in the future.